In the spring of 2024, a Chinese chip company printed a number it had never seen before, roughly 2.1 billion yuan in annual profit, on revenue that had climbed more than 400% in a single year. The pressure that produced that number did not come from Cambricon's engineers. It came from a rule change in Washington that made Nvidia's best accelerators illegal to ship across the border. One closed door, one domestic substitute standing in the corridor, one redirected river of capital, and an 8-year loss streak ended overnight. That profit figure is the anchor. Hold it. What it confirms, what it obscures, and what it cannot tell you on its own is the full chain, and each link grades differently. The chain runs from a border closure to a balance sheet, through a demand shock, a narrow customer base, and a valuation that has already priced in a story the filings do not yet fully support. 4 links confirmed or reported, 1 inferred, and the whole structure resting on a concentration ratio that most earnings headlines never mention. From there, the story turns on a single export control decision and everything it set in motion downstream. The United States Commerce Department tightened export rules on high-performance data center accelerators across several rounds, with the most consequential restrictions targeting Nvidia's highest-performing chips built for artificial intelligence workloads. Those rules are public record. Nvidia acknowledged the revenue impact in its own regulatory filings. The legal pathway for shipping the company's top data center silicon into China was eliminated or curtailed to the point of being commercially inoperable for most buyers. That is confirmed. What had been the dominant source of artificial intelligence compute for Chinese cloud operators, model developers, and state-affiliated research institutes was no longer available through legal channels. The gap that opened was not small. China's artificial intelligence build-out had been running on imported accelerators at scale. When the channel closed, procurement teams at Chinese technology companies and research institutions were holding budgets and timelines with no confirmed path to the hardware they had planned around. Domestic alternatives existed, but the field was narrower than it looked. Huawei's Ascend line had its own supply constraints, the product of earlier semiconductor sanctions that had pinched the foundry access needed to scale output quickly. The practical universe of available domestic substitutes for buyers who needed to place orders and show progress compressed significantly. That compression is reported, drawn from analyst coverage and Chinese technology press tracking procurement decisions across 2024. The buyer-level decision logic is not audited, but the pattern across multiple reported sources is consistent. Demand that had no legal path to its original destination looked for the nearest open door. Cambricon was standing at that door. The company had been publicly listed for years, was already selling accelerators targeting artificial intelligence inference and training workloads, and was positioned by accident of timing as much as by design as the available domestic option when the Nvidia channel went dark. Order flow began arriving. The rate at which it arrived was not incremental. Here is where the expectation turns over. The chip restriction applied to Nvidia's accelerators was designed at the policy level to limit China's access to the compute needed to develop frontier artificial intelligence systems. That was the stated mechanism. Deny the hardware, slow the capability. The confirmed effect, at least at the revenue layer and within a single fiscal year, ran in the opposite direction for the one domestic vendor positioned to absorb the displaced orders. The force behind Cambricon's first profitable year did not come from a generational leap in its silicon. It came from a border that closed. The tool of denial at the revenue layer became the instrument of creation. That inversion is not a policy failure in the conventional sense. It is a structural consequence of how demand relocates when a dominant supplier is removed and substitutes exist at scale. Revenue surged more than 400% year over year. Cambricon recorded approximately 2.1 billion yuan in annual net profit. Those figures come from the company's published annual earnings filing, available through Chinese exchange disclosures. The profit is confirmed. The loss streak that preceded it ran back to the company's public listing. 8 years of red ink, then a single year of Washington closing a door, and the line crossed into black. Now the picture narrows, and this is where the chain requires the most careful grading. Cambricon's own interim disclosures reported that a single customer accounted for close to 80% of first-half revenue. The top 5 customers together represented roughly 94%. Those figures come from Cambricon's filings. The identity of the dominant buyer is reported in analyst and press coverage but is not officially named in the filings reviewed. The concentration is not an estimate or a projection. It is drawn from the company's own reported numbers. Think of a restaurant that fills every table in its first profitable year because the only other kitchen in the district closed without warning. The receipts are real. The queue at the door is real. But the question of whether those diners chose this kitchen or simply had nowhere else to go is the one the revenue line cannot answer on its own. Cambricon's 2.1 billion yuan is the full till at the end of the night. The 80% customer concentration is the single table that ordered most of it. The 2.1 billion yuan figure rests on an extremely narrow demand base. The profit is confirmed. What the headline number implies about a durable franchise is not confirmed. At this stage, reading franchise strength from the revenue figure requires inferring that the customers who arrived because Nvidia's channel closed will remain once the landscape shifts again. That inference is not yet supported by the data available in the 2024 filing. This is the link the whole profit story hangs on, and it is worth saying plainly. The pivot in this chain is not the chip architecture or the engineering roadmap, it is the customer concentration ratio. 80% of first-half revenue from one buyer means the 2.1 billion yuan figure is less a market share story than a demand redirection story. Pull that one buyer, and the profit reverses. That single ratio is where the chain is thinnest and most consequential, and it is also the figure that receives the least attention in the coverage of the earnings result. The structural exposure that ratio creates is inferred, but the reasoning is direct. A dominant customer representing 80% of revenue, combined with a valuation that had priced and sustained diversified growth trajectories, means any policy reversal, any customer budget adjustment, or any competing domestic vendor gaining procurement access could redirect the same order flow that arrived in 2024. The demand that came to Cambricon because other options were closed could leave by the same mechanism if those options reopen, or if a different domestic option scales to absorb the next procurement cycle. That trajectory is inferred from the concentration figure and from the history of how policy-driven demand shifts behave in Chinese semiconductor procurement. No forward data yet confirms either direction. There are 3 soft threads in the chain worth marking, not as a list of failure modes, but as the places where a reporter notes what is not yet nailed down. The first and most significant is the one already named, a single unnamed customer near 80% of first-half intake. If that buyer slows procurement, shifts to a competing domestic vendor, or gains access through a policy revision to the accelerators it originally wanted, the revenue base compresses faster than the headline profit figure suggests. That compression risk is structural, not speculative. The second thread is valuation. Cambricon's equity price entering the earnings period had moved in anticipation of sustained, diversified growth. The kind of multiple the market assigned absorbs a strong year and still demands the next one. A valuation priced for a franchise has already borrowed against the future. If 2024 turns out to be a one-cycle windfall rather than the start of a durable customer base, the equity story and the operating story diverge sharply. The third thread is the one that tells you something about the signal quality of anything Cambricon projects forward. Earlier guidance from the company had projected figures that came in roughly 10 times lower than where the company actually landed. That gap ran in the favorable direction, which is unusual, but it also marks the degree to which Cambricon's own forward visibility was limited even in a year when demand was flowing strongly in its direction. A company that missed its own upside by that margin in a tailwind year carries forecast credibility questions into any future projection it makes. When reading current guidance from Cambricon, that track record is the discount rate. Taken together, the soft threads do not invalidate the profit. They define what the profit is, a confirmed reversal of a loss trend driven by a confirmed policy shock flowing through a reported but narrow channel. Whether 2024 was the year the channel widened permanently, or the year it happened to carry all the water before the landscape shifted, is what the 2025 filings will answer. The chain resolves to this. An export restriction applied to Nvidia's highest-performing accelerators closed a door that had supplied the majority of China's artificial intelligence compute budget. Cambricon was standing in the corridor. The order flow that had no other confirmed domestic destination arrived, and an 8-year loss streak ended. The 2.1 billion yuan is real. The architecture that generated it, one dominant buyer, a policy-dependent demand curve, a valuation priced for a franchise that may not yet exist at the scale implied, is the structure that the next cycle will either validate or expose. The restriction did not come for Cambricon, it came for Nvidia. Cambricon just happened to be the only room with an open door. Watch the 2025 interim filings. If the top customer's share of revenue contracts below 60% while total revenue holds, the franchise reading gains ground. If concentration deepens while revenue stays flat, the windfall reading does. That ratio, not the profit line, is the number that tells you which chain you are actually in. If you want the next link in China's semiconductor chain before it makes the front page, subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch it when it drops.